The Gilman Street Project, Berkeley, California. October 1992, the venue that launched 1,000 punk careers was hosting one of its legendary late-night showcases. The air was thick with cigarette smoke and teenage rebellion. Kids with mohawks and torn jackets pressed against the small stage, waiting for the next band to channel their frustration into three-chord fury. Henry Rollins stood near the back wall, arms crossed, surveying the scene like a general inspecting troops. At 31, he was already a punk legend. Black Flag's former frontman had spent years screaming about alienation and rage, turning his body into a weapon against conformity. His spoken word performances were legendary marathons of intensity, philosophical rants delivered with the force of a sledgehammer. Tonight wasn't his show, but his presence commanded respect. Young punks would glance his way, hoping for acknowledgement from the man who had helped define what punk authenticity meant. Rollins had earned his credibility through years of touring in vans, sleeping on floors, and channeling genuine anger into art that mattered. Someone mentioned that Kurt Cobain was in the building. Rollins had heard of Nirvana, of course. Everyone had by late 1992. Nevermind had exploded exactly 1 year earlier, turning three guys from Aberdeen, Washington, into the reluctant voice of a generation. But Rollins wasn't impressed by commercial success. In his view, punk wasn't about MTV rotation or Rolling Stone covers. It was about authenticity, about rage, about refusing to compromise with a system that ground people into dust. "Where is he?" Rollins asked the kid who'd mentioned Kurt's presence. "Over there, by the soundboard." Rollins followed the kid's pointing finger and saw a slight figure hunched over in a corner, wearing a ratty cardigan that looked like it had been rescued from a thrift store donation bin. Blonde hair hung in front of his face, creating a curtain between him and the world. He was nursing a beer and seemed to be trying to disappear into the wall. This was the voice of a generation? This was the guy who had supposedly brought punk to the masses? Rollins felt a mixture of skepticism and irritation. Real punks didn't hide in corners. They stood up, spoke out, confronted the world with their fists raised. Rollins walked over. "You're Kurt Cobain." Kurt looked up, his pale blue eyes meeting Rollins' intense stare for just a moment before looking away. "Yeah, Henry Rollins. I know who you are." An awkward silence stretched between them. Kids nearby had noticed the encounter and were trying to listen without appearing obvious. Two punk legends meeting at Gilman was the kind of moment that would be talked about for years. "So," Rollins said, his voice carrying that familiar edge of confrontation, "you're the guy who brought punk to the mall." Kurt didn't respond immediately. He took a sip of beer and continued staring at the floor. "Punk isn't supposed to be comfortable," Rollins continued. "It's not supposed to make kids feel better about themselves. It's supposed to be dangerous. It's supposed to be angry. Real punk comes from a place of rage, from wanting to burn the whole thing down." Kurt remained silent. "You know what I think?" Rollins pressed, his voice getting louder. "I think what you're doing isn't punk at all. It's just rock music wearing punk clothes. Where's the anger? Where's the politics? Where's the revolution?" A few kids had stopped pretending not to listen and were now openly watching the confrontation. This was exactly the kind of authenticity test that happened in punk circles, where credibility was earned through confrontation and proved through response. Kurt finished his beer and set the empty bottle on a nearby amp. He still hadn't made eye contact with Rollins. "Punk is about rage," Rollins declared, loud enough for half the room to hear. "It's about taking all that pain and anger and frustration and turning it into something that matters, something that fights back. If you're not angry, you're not punk." Kurt finally looked up, meeting Rollins' eyes directly for the first time. His expression was unreadable, somewhere between sadness and understanding. "Can I show you something?" Kurt asked quietly. Rollins was expecting an argument, a defense, maybe even a confrontation. The quiet request caught him off guard. "What?" Just, come here for a second." Kurt stood and walked toward a quieter corner of the venue, away from the watching crowd. Rollins followed, unsure what to expect. When they were far enough away that others couldn't easily hear, Kurt stopped and turned to face Rollins. The noise from the venue faded into background hum. "You want to know about rage?" Kurt asked, his voice barely above a whisper. Rollins nodded. Kurt moved closer, close enough that Rollins could smell the beer on his breath, could see the exhaustion in his eyes, could notice details that weren't visible from a distance. The cardigan wasn't just thrift store casual, it was actually falling apart. There were holes in the sleeves. The fabric was thin from overwashing. This wasn't a fashion statement. This was someone wearing the only warm clothes he owned. Frances Farmer will have her revenge on Seattle, Kurt began, his voice so quiet that Rollins had to strain to hear. It wasn't singing exactly. It was more like speaking in rhythm, like a poem being recited, but with melody woven through the words. Kurt's voice was fragile and strong at the same time, carrying pain that seemed to come from somewhere deeper than anger. I miss the comfort in being sad, Kurt continued, his whispered delivery making each word feel like a confession. Rollins realized he was hearing something that hadn't been recorded yet, something that might never be recorded. This was raw creation, unfiltered emotion, being channeled through melody and words in real time. Kurt's voice cracked slightly on certain words, not from technique failure, but from genuine emotion. This wasn't performance. This was therapy, or prayer, or exorcism. The words seemed to hurt him as he sang them, like each line was being pulled from somewhere he'd rather not go. She'll come back as fire, to burn all the liars and leave a blanket of ash on the ground. The melody was simple, almost childlike, but the emotion was devastating. Rollins found himself leaning closer, not wanting to miss a single word, a single breath. As Kurt whispered the final lines, something unexpected happened to Henry Rollins. His eyes began to water. This wasn't rage in the traditional sense. This wasn't anger that wanted to burn the world down. This was pain that had been internalized, processed, and transformed into something that somehow hurt more than screaming ever could. When Kurt finished, he looked directly at Rollins again. "That's my rage," he said quietly. "It's not loud, but it's there." Rollins stood frozen. In his entire career of confrontation and intensity, he had never been more moved by a musical moment. The whispered song had hit him somewhere deeper than any Black Flag performance ever had. "Jesus," Rollins whispered. "I'm not trying to burn anything down," Kurt continued, his voice still barely audible. "I'm trying to keep from burning myself up." Rollins realized that everything he thought he knew about punk authenticity had just been challenged. He had spent years equating loudness with honesty, aggression with truth. But Kurt had just shown him that sometimes the deepest pain was too fragile for screaming. That was... Rollins started, then stopped. He couldn't find words. "Different?" Kurt suggested. "Devastating." They stood in silence for a moment, both processing what had just happened. The noise from the venue continued around them, but they might as well have been in a different world. "I've been angry my whole life," Rollins said eventually. "Angry at my father, angry at society, angry at the world. I thought anger was the only honest response to how fucked up everything is." Kurt nodded. "But what you just did," Rollins continued, "that wasn't anger. That was something else. That was sadness as resistance." "Maybe," Kurt said, "or maybe it's just sadness." Rollins looked at this young man who had been dismissed by punk purists as a sellout, who had been criticized for making punk palatable to mainstream audiences. He realized he had completely misunderstood what Kurt was doing. "You're not trying to start a revolution," Rollins said. "No. You're trying to survive one." Kurt almost smiled. "Something like that." They walked back toward the main area of the venue, but something fundamental had changed. Rollins no longer saw Kurt as a pretender or a sellout. He saw him as someone fighting a different kind of battle, using different weapons, against enemies that couldn't be defeated with traditional punk aggression. The rest of the night passed quietly. They didn't talk much more, but Rollins found himself watching Kurt with new understanding. When bands played, Kurt didn't slam dance or shout along. He stood still, absorbing the music like someone receiving medicine. Years later, after Kurt's death in April 1994, Rollins would be asked about that night at Gilman in interviews. His response would always be careful, respectful. "I challenged Kurt about punk authenticity," he would say. "I thought punk had to be loud and angry to be real. He showed me that sometimes the most punk thing you can do is refuse to let the world make you harder than you want to be." In a 1995 spoken word performance, Rollins would tell the story more completely. I met Kurt Cobain once, and I was a complete asshole to him. I challenged him about what punk was supposed to be, told him punk was about rage. And you know what he did? He whispered a song to me that made me cry. Made me fucking cry. This kid who I thought was soft, who I thought didn't understand what real punk was, he showed me that I didn't understand what real pain was. I spent years screaming about alienation and anger, thinking that was the only authentic response to a fucked up world. Kurt showed me that sometimes the bravest thing you can do is admit you're hurt. Sometimes the most rebellious act is refusing to become the monster the world wants you to be. That night changed how I think about authenticity, about art, about what it means to resist. Kurt wasn't trying to burn the world down. He was trying to keep his own fire from going out. And maybe that's harder. The story became part of punk folklore, passed along in record store conversations and fanzine articles. It represented something important about the evolution of punk in the early 1990s, the tension between traditional hardcore values and the more introspective approach of the grunge generation. But for Rollins, it remained deeply personal. In interviews later in his career, he would often reference that night as a turning point in his understanding of what art could do, what honesty could look like. Kurt taught me that rage doesn't always have to be loud to be real, he would say. Sometimes the most powerful statement is made in a whisper. The lesson stayed with him. In his later spoken word performances, Rollins would incorporate moments of quieter introspection, allowing vulnerability to coexist with intensity. He never abandoned his confrontational style, but he added depth, nuance, the understanding that pain could be processed in different ways. The impact of that encounter rippled through both of their careers in ways that became apparent only over time. For Rollins, it marked the beginning of a more nuanced approach to his art. His later albums would incorporate moments of stark vulnerability alongside the familiar intensity. Songs like Liar and Disconnect showed influences of that night's lesson about the power of internal processing versus external expression. Kurt, meanwhile, never spoke publicly about the Gilman encounter, but those close to him noticed changes. He began incorporating more whispered, intimate moments into Nirvana's live performances. The Unplugged album that would come later seemed to draw from the same well of quiet authenticity he had shown Rollins that night. Dave Grohl, who wasn't present that evening, but heard about it later, would say in interviews that Kurt came back from that Bay Area trip with a different energy. He seemed more confident about being vulnerable, if that makes sense, Grohl recalled, like he'd proven something to himself about what his kind of punk could be. The punk community itself began to evolve around this tension between traditional hardcore values and the more introspective approach that Kurt represented. Bands like Fugazi were already exploring similar territory, but Kurt's commercial success gave permission for a broader range of emotional expression within punk frameworks. In academic circles, music critics would later identify that Gilman encounter as symbolic of a larger shift in alternative music during the early 1990s. The conversation between Rollins and Kurt represented two different generations of punk idealism, confronting each other and finding unexpected common ground. Rollins, in his 2006 memoir, devoted an entire chapter to that night, calling it the education of a punk rock fundamentalist. He wrote, "I went to that club thinking I was going to school some kid on what real punk was supposed to look like. Instead, I got schooled on what real pain looked like when it refused to become hatred. Kurt showed me that there are different ways to be uncompromising with your art." The whispered performance of Francis Farmer that night would later be recognized as a preview of some of Kurt's most powerful work. The song, when officially recorded, retained that intimate quality, that sense of confession rather than performance. Musicians who heard about that Gilman moment would cite it as inspiration for their own explorations of quiet intensity. In the years that followed, other musicians began to reference that night in interviews, even though most hadn't been there. It became something of a legend, representing a moment when punk's definition expanded to include different forms of authenticity and resistance. Ian MacKaye of Minor Threat and Fugazi, when asked about the evolution of punk in the 1990s, would often mention that night at Gilman, when Henry met his match, as a turning point. It represented punk growing up, becoming more sophisticated about what rebellion could look like. For the kids who were there that night, watching from a distance as two punk legends had their quiet confrontation, the moment became defining. Many would later become musicians themselves, carrying forward the lesson that authenticity came in many forms, that vulnerability could be as powerful as aggression, that sometimes the most important revolutions happened in whispers rather than screams, and through intimate confessions that changed hearts rather than broke them. Years after Kurt's death, when Rollins was asked during a radio interview about the most profound musical moment he'd ever experienced, his answer was immediate. A kid in a cardigan whispering a song to me in a Berkeley punk club. It lasted maybe 3 minutes and completely changed how I understand what music can do. The interviewer pressed for details and Rollins continued, "See, I thought punk was about confronting the world with your anger. Kurt showed me that sometimes punk is about confronting the world with your sadness, your vulnerability, your refusal to let pain make you cruel. That's a different kind of revolution, but it's no less important. Sometimes the quietest voices carry the deepest truths and change us most completely and forever more than we know." That night at Gilman became a touchstone for both artists, a moment when preconceptions were challenged and authentic connection happened despite generational and stylistic differences. It represented the best of punk's original promise, that art could create understanding across difference, that authenticity could take many forms, and that the most important conversations often happened away from stages and spotlights. Henry Rollins tested Kurt Cobain's punk credentials that night at Gilman, expecting to expose a pretender. Instead, Kurt exposed the limitations of Rollins' own understanding. Sometimes he most authentic rebellion comes not from screaming at the world, but from refusing to let the world steal your ability to feel pain without becoming cruel. That whispered song in a Berkeley punk club changed both of their approaches to art and authenticity. And sometimes, in quiet moments between the rage, that's exactly what punk is supposed to do.